In 1972, researchers at MIT concluded that society was on a track to collapse by the year of 2040. A follow-up study conducted by analysts at KPMG found out that we are ahead of schedule. Advanced human civilizations have existed for at most 10,000 years. In that time, many great empires rose from nothing and returned to nothing, leaving behind little more than artifacts and crumbling architecture. While it's hard for historians to definitely say what caused any of these collapses, its determining factors tend to fall into four broad categories: political issues, social and cultural issues, environmental issues, and of course, the one that we are specifically interested in, economic issues. Welcome to the Financial Flow. Please like and subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay up on our latest videos. Any civilization that has been reduced to more than an entry in a textbook fell through some combination of these four factors. Some were almost instantaneous, the great city of Pompeii succumbing to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Some took a few weeks. The Aztec Empire collapsed after 93 days of resistance against the Spanish, and some took centuries. 300 years separated the height of the Roman Empire with its eventual collapse. Our modern civilization is the greatest ever known, hundreds of thousands of times wealthier and more advanced than even the most massive empires of history could have ever imagined. If you are watching this video, you have access to the internet. You have access to numerous sources of knowledge that scholars and kings could not have dreamt of hundreds of years ago. The same is true for other modern luxuries that we took for granted. Climate control, worldwide travel, cheap and effective clothing, medicine, instantaneous communication, plentiful and safe food, tap water, and even little luxuries like being able to listen to your favorite song whenever you feel like it. A question I get asked a lot is, who is the richest person in history? The answer is Elon Musk. Or it was about a week ago, when he was worth more than $270 billion. That might have changed depending on when you watch this video. Despite what most people might think, based on their diet of cable news and front page of Reddit, we are living through one of the most peaceful periods in human history ever. Overwhelmingly, this has all been thanks to a combination of technology, education, and global cooperation. Even nations that have resentful hostilities bubbling away beneath the surface are more dependent on one another today than even the closest of allies were back in the time of Napoleon. Why get hostile when we can get rich? It sounds vapid, but it's a good thing, albeit a fickle one. Comparing our modern global economy to even the greatest empires throughout history are like comparing a jet engine to a donkey. That's not hyperbole. That's how far ahead we are today. But this is the problem. Most of us alive today, especially those of us sitting at home, watching internet videos on our smartphones, would not know how to survive very long if we didn't have food within easy reach, sometimes literally delivered to our door. But before I get ahead of myself and start sounding like a lunatic doomsday preacher, yelling that the end is near, let's break down how this MIT study projected society will collapse. What indicators did MIT use to decide whether the world was on a good or terrible track? What did these measures tell us about how our society was meant to disintegrate? Finally, is the fact that this report is ahead of schedule cause for concern, or is it simply a matter of placing too much emphasis on statistical correlations? Okay, so the MIT study, specifically titled The Limits to Growth, set out to primarily explore if our current usage of the world's resources was sustainable. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The study was one of the first economic studies ever to use computers sporting dynamic systematic models. I'm not a computer scientist, so there are plenty of people that could explain what system dynamics are far better than mine, but in brief, it is a piece of software that attempts to replicate the workings of complex real-life systems by replicating them in software. It sounds very familiar to us today, but remember, despite these limitations, the MIT team eventually created World 3, which was a computer model for the global economy. This piece of software modeled everything from variable population growth to industrial capacity. It is also crucially modeled how everything would interact with one another. For example, a large population is naturally going to require more resources, more food, more water, more homes, more of everything. But a larger population will also naturally lead to more innovation. This economic assumption is great for looking at cause-effect in isolation. For example, a soda tax increases the price of and therefore reducing the demand for sugary beverages, all other things being equal. But this is the real world. Nothing ever remains the same just because it is easier to model that way. Predicting the future is extremely hard at the best of times and almost impossible if you don't account for almost every variable. The idea was that all of these variables were important to maintaining the modern lifestyle that we enjoy today. But because they interact with one another, they were prone to feedback loops. For example, declining birth rates can lead to an aging population. An aging population will put more financial pressure on younger workers to care for the elderly, either directly by caring for them at home or indirectly through taxes to fund pension schemes and aged care. Due to the financial strain, younger employees will have less time and less favorable conditions to start a family, resulting in further declines in birth rates. This is an important example as it pertains to the MIT study. You see, while the study accounted for hundreds of variables in its computer-generated model of the global economy, it was only interested in tracking 5 of them. These were population, industrial output, food production, available resources, and pollution. It's worth remembering that this report was published in 1972, before climate change was more than a blip on the scientific community's radar, and certainly far from being the widely recognized issue it is today. Chances are, if the paper were replicated today, it would also include average global temperatures, but it was not, so it didn't. Let us go back to the economist's safe space for a second and assume all other things are equal outside of food and population. Now, these variables are dependent on one another. If one moves, the other will too, all other things being equal. But what sounds like a more concerning order of events, a decline in population leading to a decline in food production, or a decline in food production leading to a decline in population? Yes, obviously 2 very different scenarios right there. Okay, so now that we understand how to interpret the data generated by this report, what did it say? Well, like good economists, the researchers kinda hedged their bets. Predicting the future exactly is a fool's errand. They could have published their paper one day before a design for a commercially viable fusion reactor developed, and the researchers realized this. So what they did instead, they tweaked the initial conditions and ran the simulation repeatedly. Moore's law is a notable example of this. For the past 5 decades, computing power has doubled every 2 years, but we are starting to reach the physical limits of how many transistors we can pack onto a microchip. Promising technologies like quantum computing may solve this issue and let us continue to gain access to ever more computing power. But then again, it may not, and this is just one example. A lot of technological innovation these days is just major companies finding new and innovative ways for you to waste time while consuming advertiser content. Technological innovation was just one variable that the researchers of this report tweaked. They also ran models. They tried to account for every outcome that would be possible with a realistic combination of factors in this economic level. Then they averaged out the trajectories of 5 crucial factors to determine whether humanity would end up. As you would suspect from a range of models, with variables change up every time, they got a range of different results. But they all had one thing in common. They all showed a significant decline around the year 2040. The first and potentially most optimistic outcome was called the Comprehensive Technology Scenario. This was a model where we continue to live like we currently do today, but technology progressed. But that is addressed through technological innovation. The population does start to plateau around the year 2040, but that is due to the natural tendency of more wealthier urban populations to have fewer children rather than people starving to death due to lack of food. In this model, industrial output does peak and then decline, which would normally indicate lower living standards, but this is entirely counteracted by the more efficient usage of the goods that we do have. If tomorrow's technology got to such a point where we had self-driving cars, then the need for individual car ownership would be reduced. This would lead to a fall in industrial output. But it is not that we would be poorer because of this. It is just that suddenly, a car that used to service only one household can now be efficiently shared amongst dozens. This would not be a terrible outcome. And yes, we might not continue to see the exponential growth in living standards that we have seen it over the past 100 years or so, but it also would not be societal collapse either. If you do not feel comfortable relying on some new wave of technological innovation to save us, then the researchers who published this report have an alternative. The so-called stabilized world scenario is what would happen if the world just maintained its current rate of innovation, while also investing heavily into things like renewable energy resources and materials recycling processes. Again, this model was made before climate change was considered a factor. So when we are talking about recycling and renewables, we are looking at it is purely through the lens of resource depletion and local pollution, while disregarding other externalities like carbon emissions. This stabilized world scenario looks familiar. The main difference is an almost voluntary reduction in industrial output, before it creates problems like food shortages and excessive pollution. This is a model that highlights a clear collapse. Pollution continues to increase exponentially, and things like recycling of common materials has never become economically viable or subsidized widely enough. The industrial output does reach a higher level than in all of the other possible scenarios, but that is about where the good news ends. A drop in food production causes massively declining birth rates in rich countries and famines in poor countries. The lack of young workers reduces industrial output, which further hinders economic prosperity. Easily accessible resources also dwindle away. This is what you would consider a complete collapse of society. It is worth noting that a lot of these criticisms have been proven wrong simply by the fact that the data is tracking the predictions in the business as usual model with frightening accuracy. Other critics point out that this study has a very pessimistic way of modeling human innovation. These critics conceded that, yes, sure, right now our rate of innovation might not be sufficient to avoid this kind of collapse. Necessity is the mother of invention. As soon as humanity's back are against the proverbial wall, a lot of attention will be placed on researching and investing in technologies that could push us from the doomsday scenario of the business as usual model into the more palatable comprehensive technology scenario. We can already start to see this taking place with a huge surge in renewable technologies becoming available in the public market. Certainly, there are still areas where we are lacking. Waste management is a huge one, but we are much better than we were even a decade ago. If you want me to tell you what I think will happen, then I am sorry, but I would just encourage you to read those two reports yourself. I want to be optimistic about the future, but I also realize that my opinion does not carry as much weight as research published by a collection of 17 of the world's top economists and scientists, research that has been vindicated by other incredibly talented individuals. In best case scenario, this was all massively overblown and we could use this as an excuse to learn about the limits of creating systematic models to predict the future. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Have a good one.